In the heart of the Ashanti Kingdom, where the vast lush forest met the sprawling savannah, lived two sisters, Adwoa and Akua. The two had been inseparable, their bond as close as the rivers that ran through the land, their hearts as intertwined as the roots of the ancient trees. Adwoa, the younger of the two, was a girl with an unyielding spirit, sharp wit, and a smile that could light up the darkest corners of their home. Akua, though older, was quieter and more contemplative. She would often sit beside Adwoa, running her fingers through her sister's long hair, and together they would dream of a future filled with peace, happiness, and success. But their mother, Nana Afia, passed away when Adwoa was just a child. It was a loss that cut deeply into the heart of the family. Their father, Kojo, a strong and proud man, had to take on both the role of father and mother, a task he performed admirably. But as time went on, the emptiness in the house grew, and their mother's absence left a gap that neither Adwoa nor Akua could fill. Their father, burdened by loneliness and the demands of raising two daughters, soon remarried. The woman he chose was named Afia. At first, she seemed like a perfect match for him. She was beautiful, charming, and well-mannered. But beneath the surface, Afia's nature was different. Her beauty was deceiving, and her charm hid a heart filled with envy, selfishness, and ambition. She longed for an even more prosperous life than her marriage had already provided. Afia's arrival into their lives was nothing short of dramatic. She came with promises of a better future, speaking of grand dreams and aspirations for the family. The sisters, who had not known many other women apart from their mother, were hopeful that Afia's presence would restore the warmth that had once existed in their home. But this hope was short-lived. It was Akua who first noticed something was amiss. Afia seemed kind enough in the early days, always with a sweet word or a gentle smile. But slowly, Akua began to see the subtle signs of manipulation. Afia would always praise her daughter, Essie, even for the smallest of accomplishments, while Adwoa was left to fend for herself in silence. If Adwoa did something well, it was dismissed or belittled. She had been taught that a woman's worth was in her beauty and grace, and while Akua had inherited their mother's quiet demeanor, it was Adwoa who had inherited the sharpness of her wit and the brilliance of her intellect. But it was the way Afia treated Adwoa that stood out the most. In the mornings, when the sun barely kissed the earth, Afia would assign the hardest chores to her stepdaughter, cleaning the entire yard, fetching water from the distant river, and preparing meals with little regard for Adwoa's needs. Afia's own daughter, Essie, on the other hand, was treated with love and gentleness. She was allowed to sit by the fire, rest, and do little. The imbalance was glaring, and Adwoa soon learned that her stepmother's kindness came with strings attached, strings that bound her to servitude. At first, Adwoa tried to ignore it. She continued to do as she was asked, quietly bearing the weight of her chores and responsibilities. She tried to find joy in the small moments, like when she would sneak into the garden to pick a ripe mango, or when she would sit with Akua by the river, talking about the future. But as days turned into weeks, the cruelty became harder to ignore. One day, after spending hours gathering firewood for the household, Adwoa returned home to find the front door locked. Afia, seeing her approach, simply turned away and without a word locked the door in her face.
Where's my dinner?
You're not eating tonight. You should learn to be more useful.
Adwoa stood frozen for a moment, hurt and angry. She had always been taught that family meant support, and yet here she was, shut out by the very woman who was supposed to care for her. She knew, deep down, that Afia's actions were deliberate, a way to break her spirit and make her feel inferior. It was then that Adwoa understood that her stepmother's bitterness was rooted in something much deeper than mere dislike. Afia was jealous of the bond Adwoa shared with her father. She feared that despite everything, Adwoa might still be the one to carry on the legacy of their family's strength and honor. Adwoa was no fool. She had seen how her father's gaze lingered on her when he spoke of the future. She had witnessed the proud smile he wore when he saw the intelligence and cleverness in her eyes, and though he tried his best to be fair, his love for her could not be hidden. But this only seemed to fuel Afia's wrath. She knew she had to act quickly to undermine Adwoa and ensure that her daughter, Essie, would take her place in the family. Essie, though kind and gentle, had no true ambition or desire to lead the family. She was content to sit back and enjoy the comforts her mother provided. But Afia had no intention of seeing Essie fall behind her stepdaughter in any way. Over the course of the next few months, Afia's treatment of Adwoa became even more cruel and demeaning. Afia would often send Adwoa into the forest to collect herbs for medicine, knowing well that the forest was filled with wild animals. She would make Adwoa go to the farthest parts of the village to fetch water from the well, often returning after sunset, tired and cold. And then one fateful evening, after Adwoa had returned from her chores, Afia decided it was time to push her further.
You should learn your place, Adwoa. There are things that you will never have, no matter how much you wish. I will make sure of that.
It was that night that Afia made a cruel decision that would change everything for Adwoa. She sent Adwoa to the river, claiming that the water there would heal a sick relative. Little did Adwoa know, this would be the beginning of her true test. As the days passed, the tension in the house grew thicker, like the humid air before a storm. Afia's jealousy festered in the shadows, unseen by the family, but evident in her every action. While her husband Kojo continued to dote on her, unaware of the cruelty she was inflicting upon his daughters, Adwoa and Akua could feel the distance between them and their stepmother widen. Afia's animosity toward Adwoa wasn't just about housework or minor insults. It was a deeper, more insidious feeling that gnawed at her soul. Afia's insecurities ran deep. She had always been known for her beauty, but it was clear to her that her own daughter, Isi, did not possess the same charm or grace. She knew that her daughter would never command the same respect and admiration that Adwoa naturally seemed to attract. And so, Afia's resentment grew, poisoning her thoughts and actions. In the marketplace, when they went to buy food or goods, Afia would often make sure that Adwoa was ignored or dismissed by the other villagers. She would boast about her own daughter, Isi, and how poised and beautiful she was, while she subtly belittled Adwoa.
Look at my daughter. She carries herself like a queen. Isi will surely marry the most powerful man in the land.
Meanwhile, Essie, who was content to follow in her mother's footsteps, paid little attention to the ongoing tension. She was often seen in the background, helping her mother or sitting idly by, content with being sheltered from the harsh realities around her. But Adwoa saw the truth. She knew her stepmother's cruelty wasn't only directed at her. Akua, too, had felt the sting of Afia's harsh words and cold treatment. Akua, however, had learned to stay quiet, biding her time and watching the situation unfold. She had learned to endure, but Adwoa was a different spirit altogether. She was strong-willed and stubborn, never afraid to confront the truth, even if it meant standing alone. The kindness of their late mother still lingered in the house, but it was no longer enough to balance out the darkness that Afia cast over their lives. Adwoa remembered the lessons her mother had taught her, the value of kindness, of helping others, of standing up for what's right. Those memories kept her going, despite the cruel treatment from her stepmother. One evening, as the family gathered around the fire after a long day's work, Afia launched into her usual tirade about how difficult it was to raise children who didn't appreciate the comforts they had.
Your father is a kind man. He works hard every day to provide for this family. But what do I get in return? Children who don't help when they're needed. Children who think they deserve everything handed to them.
Adwoa looked at her father, who was silent as usual, his eyes downcast as he fiddled with his tools. He knew the weight of his daughter's frustrations, but he did not yet know how deep Afia's bitterness went. Afia's words were sharp, aimed to cut at the heart of the girl's dignity. Her insults were calculated to belittle their efforts and sap their self-worth. It was a form of psychological warfare, one that left no visible scars, but still wounded deeply.
I can't imagine what you two will do when you are grown. I suppose I will just have to take care of everything, as I always do.
Adwoa, who had been silently fuming, stood up abruptly.
Mother, why do you speak to us this way? We work hard just as you do. Why must you treat us like this?
The words hung in the air, heavy with the truth that Adwoa had spoken. Afia's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a tight smile.
Don't think I don't know what you're trying to do, Adwoa. You think you can challenge me? You think you can be better than me?
The fire crackled in the background, the only sound breaking the tense silence. Adwoa, feeling a rush of emotion, turned to her father for support, but Kojo remained silent. He had grown weary of the constant strife, of the daily friction between his daughters and his wife. He was not blind to Afia's cruelty, but he had allowed it to continue, too afraid of confronting her. Akua, who had always been the peacemaker, stood up as well.
Father, can't you see what's happening? This isn't just about chores. This is about a mother who favours her own child while trying to break down the others. We deserve better than this.
Kojo's face flushed with a mixture of guilt and frustration. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He had long since allowed Afia to control the household, too fearful to rock the boat. The girls' voices were filled with pain, and Kojo knew that he had failed them as a father. Afia, sensing her control slipping, quickly changed her tone.
Enough of this nonsense. You don't know how to respect your elders, and you certainly don't know your place in this family. You think you can stand up to me?
Adwoa's heart raced. She had finally stood up to her stepmother, but it felt like an uphill battle she could not win. She had endured enough, and yet Afia's words had cut deeper than anything she had ever experienced before. Her world seemed to be closing in, and she felt the weight of her stepmother's bitterness bearing down on her soul. But the thing that hurt most was the lack of support from her father. She had always admired him, trusted him, but now, his silence felt like a betrayal.
I don't care about your words anymore. If you continue to treat me this way, I will leave.
With that, she stormed out of the house, her heart pounding in her chest. She needed space to breathe, to think. The cool night air hit her as she stepped outside, and she found herself walking toward the river, the only place where she could find solace. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale glow over the village. The air was heavy with the promise of change, and for Adwoa, the weight of her stepmother's cruelty had become unbearable. She had spent countless hours in the fields, doing everything Afia asked of her, and yet no matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. Her stepmother's favoritism toward her own daughter, Isi, was glaring. Every time Adwoa did something right, Afia would either ignore it or find a way to diminish it. Every time Essie did something trivial, Afia would shower her with praise. She had taken Adwoa's confidence and crushed it with her words. Slowly, the girl began to feel as though she had no place in the world she had once known. The turning point came one evening, after another long day spent carrying firewood. Adwoa had returned to the village late, the sun already setting, casting the world in hues of orange and pink. She could hear the sounds of laughter from her stepmother's hut, where Afia and Daisy were sharing a meal. Adwoa stood outside, exhausted and hungry, her hands raw from the day's labor. Her father had not returned from his work yet, and the house was silent except for the chatter inside. She could see her father's house in the distance, the familiar thatched roof against the backdrop of the mountains. But in that moment, it no longer felt like home. She stood there, torn between going inside or running far away. She chose the latter. Her heart pounded in her chest as she left the familiar path and made her way toward the forest. The trees seemed to whisper to her as she ventured deeper into the darkening woods, the leaves crunching beneath her bare feet. She didn't know where she was headed, but she needed to get away. Away from Afia, away from the house, away from everything that was causing her pain. The forest was silent but for the occasional chirp of a bird and the rustling of leaves. As she walked, she began to think about the life her mother had always dreamed of for her, one of peace, love, and respect. She thought about the promise her mother had made to her on her deathbed, that she would never have to endure the suffering her stepmother imposed on her. But what could she do? She was just a young girl, with no way to change her fate. And yet, as if answering her thoughts, a strange light appeared in the distance. It was faint at first, just a flicker between the trees, but as Adwoa walked closer, the light grew brighter. She stepped forward cautiously, her curiosity piqued. The air around her seemed to thrum with energy, and she felt an inexplicable pull, like an unseen force was guiding her. Adwoa found herself standing before a clearing in the forest, bathed in a soft, ethereal glow. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient, gnarled tree, its twisted branches stretching toward the heavens. At the base of the tree, a woman sat, cloaked in a flowing garment that shimmered with the light of the moon. The woman looked up at her, her eyes as deep as the forest itself. There was wisdom in her gaze, as though she had seen the world change many times over. "You have come far, child," the woman said, her voice soft yet commanding. Adwoa, stunned, could barely find her words. Who are you?" she asked. The woman smiled gently. "I am a spirit of the forest. I have watched you suffer under the weight of injustice. Your heart is pure, but your path is clouded by anger and fear." Adwoa stepped closer, her voice trembling. "What can I do? I don't have the power to change anything. My stepmother is too strong. My father, he doesn't see what's happening." The woman nodded slowly. "The pain you feel is real, but it is not forever. You are not as helpless as you think. There is a way to change your fate, but it will require great courage." Adwoa listened intently, her heart racing. "What must I do?" she asked. The woman reached into the folds of her cloak and pulled out a small, shimmering stone. It glowed with an inner light, its colors shifting and changing like the sky at dawn. She handed it to Adwoa. "This is the river stone," the woman explained. "It holds the power to reveal the truth. It can show you what lies beyond the surface of things. If you use it wisely, it will guide you toward the right path. But be warned, the truth it reveals may not always be easy to accept." Adwoa held the stone in her hands, feeling its warmth. She could feel its power thrumming beneath her fingertips. For a moment she hesitated, but then, with a deep breath, she nodded. "I will do it," she said, her voice filled with determination. The woman smiled, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Adwoa felt a spark of hope. As Adwoa made her way back to the village, her mind was buzzing with questions. She held the river stone tightly, knowing that whatever it revealed, she would have to face it. She wasn't sure what was going to happen, but she was no longer afraid. She had a newfound sense of strength, a strength that came from within. When she arrived at the house, her father was sitting outside, his weary face illuminated by the flickering light of the fire. He looked up as Adwoa approached, a mixture of surprise and concern in his eyes. "Adwoa?" he said softly. "Where have you been?" "I needed some time to think," she replied. "I've been thinking a lot, Father, about our family and about what I want my life to be." Her father looked at her, his eyes filled with both love and guilt. He knew, deep down, that his daughters had suffered because of his silence. But he had always hoped that things would change, that somehow they could endure without confrontation. "Adwoa," he said, "I know you've been carrying a heavy burden. I've seen how Afia treats you, and I regret not doing more. I'm sorry." Adwoa smiled faintly, relieved that her father was finally acknowledging the truth. "It's not too late, Father, but it will take courage from all of us to change things."